there. Where are you going all over the place? It's right there.
This here? Say hi to Brian. Hi, Brian. Yay.
I had to unmute to say hi. There you go. Hi.
Hi. See, I'm just going to bed, and then Mommy will be right back.
Perfect.
Yeah, you're going to bed. Yeah, I know. It's so depressing.
Okay, I guess it's good as time as any to get started. So thanks everyone for joining us tonight. This is the third session that we have done so far on Zoom in lieu of our conference.
If you don't close that, you can't control your volume, Dave. You have to close that.
I'm just going to ask everyone to please keep yourself on mute unless you're speaking, just because there's a lot of us on and it's going to be hard to hear otherwise. But later on, we're going to have the opportunity to ask any questions you want. So at that point, you can go ahead and unmute yourself for your questions. Yeah, so this is the third session. We've done a session so far on compassion for self-caregivers. We've done one on literacy and communication. And tonight we're going to be talking about research. So very exciting topic. We've got a panel with us tonight. Hello? Okay, so we've got Evdokia Anagnostou, we have James Eubanks, and we've got Kevin Morton. So I think instead of reading your bios, I'm just going to go one by one, and I'm going to ask you guys to give a brief introduction. Maybe tell me when it was you first heard about Rett syndrome and kind of what your involvement has been in the Rett syndrome community, with research, and kind of what you're up to professionally these days. So we'll start with Dr. Anagnostou.
Hi, everybody. I'm Evdokia Anagnostou. I'm a child neurologist by training. I lead the Autism Research Centre at Holland Bloorview, University of Toronto, and I lead a network called the Province of Ontario Neurodevelopmental Disorders Network. That is a network that goes across Western to Eastern Ontario. We just don't have representation in the North. That is dedicated to studying a variety of neurodevelopmental conditions, and Rett's is in our portfolio. I also lead a clinical trials network in Ontario that is dedicated to neurodevelopmental disorders, which is why I'm here today. And so we have been trying to get the trial off the ground for Rett, and we can talk about that later. And first time I got to meet a girl with Rett, must have been a resident, as a child neurology resident in Montreal, and I won't tell you how long ago this was.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Eubanks.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jim Eubanks. I'm a senior scientist at the Krembil Research Institute in Toronto. My laboratory has been studying neurodevelopmental conditions broadly defined for the better part of, doing the math in my head, and I guess I'm going to say 25 years. I guess we really started in Rett syndrome without even realizing we were studying Rett syndrome in 1995. And then one afternoon, one of my graduate students in 2000 walked into my lab and said, sorry, it was 1999, MECP2 is the cause for Rett syndrome. And we'd been working on MECP2 since I started my lab. And only then did we realize that we were actually working on an actual condition rather than an academic venture. And we've been pursuing various aspects of moving more towards translational studies ever since that time. And be happy to try to answer questions if there may be some when we have the session later.
Great, thanks so much. And Kevin, could you introduce yourself, please?
So I'm Kevin Morton. I'm the president of the Ontario Rett Syndrome Association. The first girl that I met with Rett syndrome was my daughter Elle when she was born. However, it took us about 6 years to get her diagnosed with Rett syndrome. In my spare time, I sell windows and doors.
Thanks, Kevin.
Short and sweet.
Okay, so I thought what we would do tonight is kind of start from the bottom, talk about basic research, and O.R.S.A has the Hope Fund, which is kind of dedicated to research. So far, all the money from the Hope Fund has gone to basic research. We have not had any clinical trials yet in Canada. So I was hoping Kevin could just tell us a little bit about what the Hope Fund is and how the funds get allocated, and then we'll talk a little bit about who our grant recipients were for the previous year.
Sure, no problem. So the Hope Fund is dedicated to Canadian research. We have an advisory panel. Basically, we do a call for grants. The board of directors decides on an annual basis how much money we have in a restricted fund called the Hope Fund to be able to use for grants. In 2019, we allocated $150,000 towards grants. And since 2014, we've done over $500,000 in grants for Canadian Rett syndrome research. Right now, there is some money in the Hope Fund for us to be able to do a grant in 2020. With this whole COVID situation, we haven't pulled the trigger yet on making any sort of announcement. The Office of the Public Guardian and Trustees has made an announcement basically saying any charities are allowed to use restricted funds for their daily operating expenses for right now, given the situation. However, O.R.S.A's financial position is quite strong, and we've went and redid our budget in March to kind of prepare for COVID, and it looks like we still should be able to do a grant in 2020.
Which is great news. Could you tell us a little bit about the process of awarding the grants?
Sure. So basically, we do a call for grants on an annual basis. There's a deadline for research to submit their grants. Once they do submit their grants, it's basically an advisory board looks at each one of the grants and makes a recommendation to the board of directors on which grants we should provide funding for. Everybody that applies for a grant isn't on our advisory board. They go at arm's length just to make it fair. And then they make a recommendation. And I mean, the board of directors of O.R.S.A isn't qualified or educated enough to make the proper decision on which grants make the most sense to fund. So we rely on our advisory board to help us in that sense.
Great, thanks.
No problem.
All right, so last year we awarded 2 grants. The first one was $100,000 to pair Dr. John Vincent and Dr. Juan Ausio. So neither of which could be with us tonight, unfortunately. So we're gonna have to pick apart this study that they're doing. So I'm just gonna give you a brief overview. It's really what they're working on is like a drug screening. So their project is entitled Therapeutic Small Molecules and Peptides Targeting Missense Mutations in Rett Syndrome. So it's very specific to individuals with Rett syndrome that have that a missense mutation as opposed to one of the other types of mutations. So they were, hoping to be able to screen using their system approximately 10 million molecules to find one with the target-specific residues within a MECP2 binding domain. They will then be able to test successful candidate molecules to see which will reverse the molecular defects in MECP2, paving the way for preclinical studies. So, don't want to put you on the spot, but James Eubanks, maybe you could
Sure.
give your
I'm actually
interpretation of this.
Yeah, I'm actually very, very familiar with their work.
Great.
So the idea is that the missense mutations are the type of mutations that only change one amino acid in this case MECP2 protein, and most commonly those changes occur within the region of the protein that binds to the methylated DNA, and that modification renders it less stable or less tightly bound to the DNA templates. And since the DNA templates are still there, the problem resides with getting that new mutant form of MECP2 to regain its ability to bind. So the idea is, if you'll use the lock and key analogy, is that the key is still there, it just doesn't quite fit in the lock as properly as it should, so it can only partially turn the key, or turn the lock. Their idea is that there may well be some molecule or peptide that would supply what's missing in the key and compensate and allow it then to slip into the lock and turn it properly. And there is some evidence to support that. A laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania showed that if you take one type of the missense mutation, T158M, I believe, and overexpress it, but make it more prevalent, you can actually force it to do what it can't do at its normal levels. And so what Juan and John are proposing is to find something that will be a surrogate for the overexpression and allow the system to regain its functionality.
Great, thank you. Did anyone have any questions about that one before we move on? No, okay. Yeah, so next grant was $50,000 award to Dr. James Eubanks. So I'll turn it over to you to talk about what you and your lab are doing.
So we're actually quite excited about this, but I have to say that unfortunately our progress here has been a victim of COVID, and our lab was shut down right about the time we were starting to engage in these efforts. The work stems from some of the genetic studies that we've done, where we've identified a particular type of surveillance receptor. I won't get into the specifics, but it is very well expressed in the brain. And it's a system that gets activated in times of stress or in times when the neural circuitry is out of its normal homeostasis. And so through genetic ablation and some other approaches, we were able to show that if you remove at least part of this factor, in our hands it was a little more than half, in mice, the Rett-like phenotype of the MECP2 deficient mice became dramatically improved, better than any pharmacological study that's been done to date, and better than any genetic study, save the gene reactivation studies. And so we think that this new surveillance receptor is a bona fide target to be engaged for translational development. What the HOPE award that we received would allow us to pursue is to test a already existing drug that could be repurposed in the animal model to see whether it affords the same type of benefit that our genetic knockout studies did. It's high risk. The drug is not one that has been traditionally used for this particular receptor. It's what we call a dirty drug. It hits lots of things. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad, and we don't know what the case will be here. But we do want to put it in the mice, and if we get any improvement, then that would certainly greenlight us to look for better drugs, or to use the medicinal chemistry approach to make the dirty drug a little less dirty and clean it up so that it would have a better efficacy for this particular target. And if I could just add one more part to this, some of this work actually stemmed from the antioxidant work that we were doing some years ago that was supported in part by O.R.S.A. So it all fits in a logical progression. And I know some people who are on the call are aware, my lab was successful in receiving a significant grant from the United States Department of Defense, and the final signatures went on that grant yesterday. and the term is 3 years. And when you do the exchange rates, it is just north of $2 million US. So
Amazing.
thank you, O.R.S.A, for providing the at least part of the starting platform that allowed those initial studies to be tested. The RettSyndrome.org also awarded us a basic science grant to test some of those things. And together you guys provided what was necessary for us to get a much larger award and hopefully move the field forward.
Awesome. Congratulations.
It's our absolute pleasure too, Dr. Eubanks.
So one question I know many people might have then is like, what would make the U.S. Department of Defense interested in this line of research?
So there's actually quite a long story to that. It wasn't something that just happened overnight. It took quite a lot of lobbying. Kudos to Steve Kaminsky, who was the former scientific officer of RettSyndrome.org, for beating a lot of pavement. But he managed to catch the attention of both a Democratic and a Republican, I believe they were senators, who both understood how phenotypes or how symptoms that are common in Rett syndrome patients, such as hypersympathetic tone or too much responsiveness to startle, poor thermal regulation, which involves too much vasodilation. These are things that are often seen in soldiers coming back from battle with post-traumatic stress disorder. Lots of Rett syndrome patients have seizures. So do a lot of soldiers who have head injuries. And so those were a couple of the things that the senators saw that had a commonality, not just an endpoint, but potentially mechanism. And so with the strong lobbying and the support from various organizations, they convinced their colleagues to support this and made it a recognized entity in the congressionally mandated research program for the Department of Defense. And there have been a couple of previous awards to Rett syndrome investigators through the Department of Defense. And we're quite happy that we've been able to keep that moniker going for at least another term.
That's great. All right, any other questions for Dr. Eubanks? If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask it, or you can type in the chat box or even raise your hand. It's funny, sometimes we'll get everyone wanting to ask a question and sometimes no one at all, but we'll open the floor at the end as well for just any questions to do with the topic in general. Okay, so I am going to turn it over to Dr. Anagnostou now to give an update on this trial, which we've been trying to get off the ground for a couple of years now.
Yes, so just to remind everybody, and it was already mentioned, this was a pilot randomized clinical control trial that was based on some findings that came out of Dr. Eubanks' lab from funding that had previously gone from O.R.S.A to that lab, that had shown in the animal model a partial rescue of the motor phenotype on the Rett mouse model, the MECP2 mouse model. And the advantage of that particular cocktail, if you like it, is that, I apologize everybody, I'm coughing, but I don't have COVID, they tested me in the hospital. Is that all the components of the cocktail are approved through the Natural Health Substances section of Health Canada. So the combination would have been a little bit easier to get through Health Canada for a clinical trial. So we've talked about this before. The design of the study is supposed to be a random control trial, which means half the kids get drug and half the kids get placebo, but to make sure that everybody has a chance. And because we only get smaller numbers than other conditions with Rett syndrome, we're doing a crossover study, which means that for the first half, the first 8 weeks, half the kids will get drug or placebo. then they'll stop for 2 weeks, and then they're gonna come back and switch. So the kids who were getting drug are gonna get placebo, which is our sugar pill, and the kids who were getting placebo were gonna get drug. Nobody will know who's getting what until the whole study is done, and we can unblind it and look at how the kids who got, how everybody would have gotten the drug at some point, and everybody would have gotten placebo at some point, and we're gonna compare the response during the time that they were taking the drug versus the time that they were taking the placebo. So that's the premise. It has been funded actually through the Province of Ontario Neurodevelopmental Disorders Network. The problem we've had so far was manufacturing of this compound. There've been a lot of back and forth, and O.R.S.A has clearly advocated. And finally, with O.R.S.A's support, the Ontario Brain Institute decided to actually fund the manufacturing this year. And so we've been given now July 18th as the delivery date, which is, I think, 9 days from now. So if it's by the end of July, I will be very, very happy, which means that sometime in August, theoretically, we can start. But then we can talk about COVID and all of that kind of stuff. But that's where the trial stands right now.
Great news. Yeah, so probably the first question on everyone's mind is COVID. How is that affecting clinical trials in general right now? So
COVID has been actually devastating to research. I let Jim tell you more about what happened to the animal model labs, which was really tragic. In the human side of things, all face-to-face human research was suspended on March 21st or 22nd, something like that. And the only exception was what was considered essential service, which was clinical trials that had kids randomized who were already taking the experimental compound. So if you had a trial that had kids already in it, that were already taking an experimental compound, you were allowed to continue to see them, which we were doing in other studies, but you were not allowed to start a new trial and start bringing kids in who did not have the opportunity to experience the risk from before. So what happened in the last 2 weeks, basically the government did not issue an order specific to trials. They issued guidance around what they call essential health service. And so most hospitals and most jurisdictions called kids who are already in trials as essential health service, but kids who were not already in trials, not essential health service. They did agree though that it was the equivalent of going to see your doctor in the hospital for a clinic appointment. So the commitment that we got was that once clinics were starting to open, then we would have the opportunity to recruit kids, new kids into trials. This happened in the last 2 weeks. So theoretically speaking, we can start. Pragmatically, what happens is there is a head count every day in the hospital. So there is a certain number of kids that can cross the doors to make sure that social distancing and no crowds and all of that actually gets maintained. So although we may be starting in August, we may be able to bring only 1 or 2 kids every month in, or 3 or 4. We'll see what the numbers would look like. Right now, the whole Autism Center, which is basically the whole developmental center, can bring a total of 4 kids a week across different programs. Now, trials do get preference, but you can see how it will be slow starting, just not because we can't do it, but because they have to count heads of people who are in the hospital and our heads too. So we have an app where we log in when we're in, and they make sure that a certain number of people are in, and they kick you out if the number of people actually exceeds the expected number every day. So that's one issue. But my suggestion would be that we don't obsess about it. The whole world is in this condition. If we have drug and we're ready to start, let's start. And if it's slow, it's slow, and that's okay. We get going. The second issue is PPEs, so protection against the virus. So according to the existing rules, both the kids and the docs and everybody who's involved and the parents would have to wear masks. And some of us, the physicians also are wearing goggles and shields and all of this. So we will have to see, I mean, you guys are gonna give us advice, right? So we will have to see how much our kids tolerate this kind of situation. So can they tolerate for a couple of hours to be in the hospital with a mask on? If they can't have the mask on, we still have managed to get some exceptions. We will get permission kid by kid, but we would have to be in full gear. So again, you would have to tell us whether your child will find it more frightening to see a physician in full gear than their usual contact with human beings. And so we would have to have these discussions when we get started. And it may be that's how we prioritize which kids come in first, because it will not feel normal. Nothing about this will feel normal to the kids. And so we may want to start with kids that you feel would be totally comfortable with a situation like that, and iron it out as we go, and then talk to you about modifications and what's working and what's not working and that kind of thing. The last thing the hospital is doing that I don't think would be of great value to you, but you can think about it, is establishing stations that have plexiglass. So you can see a family or a kid on the other side of the plexiglass without a mask. That is nice when you talk to a family, but obviously you cannot examine a kid with Rett syndrome across a plexiglass. So I do think it would have some limitations. Maybe we can do an interview with a family over the plexiglass, but we would have to be in full gear when we actually examine the kids. So things to think about, but I think the most important thing is hopefully we have drug by the end of July, if they're not lying to us. And I think if they let us start, we should start, even if it's very slow, just to get it going and iron out the details of how this would work, because the truth is COVID may be here to stay until the vaccine is out, so another 18 months or so, a year, 18 months. So we may have to learn to do stuff while we have all these kinds of limitations.
Great, thanks. Can you tell us a little bit about the study design, like how often the individuals would need to come into the hospital, and if any of that has changed due to COVID?
Yeah, so the design is that you have 8 weeks in the first phase, right? Whether you're on drug or placebo, you get 2 weeks break, and then you have another 8 weeks. During the 8-week period, you have 3 visits: your baseline visit, a visit in the middle at 1 month time, and a visit at the end of that period at the 2-month point, and then again another 3 visits for the second phase. We've been having some discussions about whether the assessment that's in the middle, so the 4-week assessment, could be done remotely. We can do this 2 ways. We can take the protocol deviations and live with it, or we can make an amendment to the Health Canada protocol, but then Health Canada gets to judge whether we are making a reasonable decision or not. The most important thing there is that if we miss that middle visit, the visit at the end can never be missed, because if that visit gets missed, the whole participation of the child is useless. We don't have any outcome measure for the time that they were exposed to the drug. So typically we have lots and lots of visits. In this one, we had simplified it to have 1 middle follow-up and 1 final for each phase. If we skip the middle, we wouldn't completely skip it. We would do some things virtually, but we can't do everything virtually. I think we can convince Health Canada to do that because the safety profile of what we are using is fairly good. And so they cannot argue that we need to check on safety in person. So we would basically miss some of our outcome measures, which are whether the drug is actually working. And so for those things, we'll get some. The ones that are parent reports we'll get, but the ones that we have to observe the kid doing stuff, we may or may not be able to get. So we can have these discussions. If we get started, we can absolutely have these discussions and see whether the middle visit can be done remotely. Obviously, we would love to have the kids in. So I would take some missing data than not having the kids at all, right? So, but we cannot have the first visit and the last visit of each phase remote, because then we have an established safety profile, and that would be unacceptable to Health Canada. And to us, to be honest, it would be as benign as we think the combination is. The truth is the combination as is has not been tested properly, so, and not in kids with Retts. And so some safety should be collected.
Great, totally makes sense. Maybe you could describe a little bit about what the assessments are. I know some trials rely a lot on caregiver assessments, some lean more towards clinical assessments. There's also biomarkers quite often. What will you be doing for this trial?
Yeah, so the design is very similar. So we decided to have quite a bit of similarity with phase 2, phase 3 programs. So these are the programs that have been relatively advanced in Rett's research, so that we can compare to how other compounds are behaving in this space. So there is a few outcome measures that are questionnaires, and they're straightforward from the parents. But there are a couple that you guys may be familiar with, where some of the questions are questions to the parent, but some of the questions are direct observation. So again, they have to stand, they have to take a step, they have to reach for an object, they have to look right and left and move their eyes around based on an item that's moving, those kinds of things. So those would be trickier to do remotely, as you can imagine. The biomarker piece is very important, and thank you for reminding me this, because in fact, we have a donor outside of the Ontario Brain Institute that gave us $200,000 just to do biomarker work. And so what we have developed a partnership with Dr. O.R.S.A at University of Toronto to look at some basic changes in the markers that we think should change with the mitochondrial cocktail, but also look at epigenetic changes. So looking at how the genes change the way they talk to the body in response to this particular cocktail. So it's based on previous evidence for each one of the components of the cocktail. When you put them together, things may change. And the other reason this is very important is, even if we don't get it, so we're only treating kids, remember, for 8 weeks. So although your participation is 18 weeks, because you have 8 weeks and 8 weeks and a 2-week break, only 8 weeks out of that is the actual compound. So somebody could argue that this is too short to see anything, right? In fact, we would argue that. It's just that it's hard to keep kids on placebos for like months and months at a time. So if we had no effect on the behavior or the movement or the things that we're looking at, but we have it on the biomarker, we call this an early read. So that means that we know we have sifted the biology in a favorable way, but we didn't have enough time, potentially we didn't have enough time to see it. And so that would be a reason then to convince you to go into a longer trial where you'd maybe stuck sitting on placebo for a long time, because we would have evidence that the biology is changing, but we just cannot quite capture it on the things that we are measuring just yet.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Thank you. So I'll open up to questions now.
Right. Just on that trial, Brian, one thing that O.R.S.A is in the process of doing is we're developing a travel and lodging support guidelines that we're going to try and provide some funding for families from within province, but also out of province, to be able to participate in the trial if they would like to. We haven't finalized it yet because we were kind of waiting for the date of when the trial is going to start, but it looks like we are getting close to a modified version of the launch. And when that comes out, O.R.S.A will obviously be announcing the trial and some of the details, working very closely with Evdokia. But we're going to be also hopefully being able to provide some funding for families.
That's awesome. Yeah, I know, like in the US, some of these trials that are being run by big pharmaceutical companies, they've got the money to be able to fly kids around and provide for a lot of the expenses pertaining to travel. So something like this is more of a research-generated project that, you know, that money's a lot harder to come by. So yeah, I'm glad O.R.S.A is going to be able to do this.
Yeah, and I mean, it was one family that did some fundraising pre-COVID that said they'd like the money to go towards other families to be able to participate in the trial. So there's, O.R.S.A has a lump sum available to allocate to families for this.
Awesome. There's a couple of questions in the chat. The first one was from Terry Boyd asking if it's possible to share the amount of funding that OBI provided.
Yes, I can do that, but I can't do it right now off the top of my head because it is part of the POND grant, and I have to look at what % of that went to that particular trial. I think, so what I can tell you right now, it's several $100,000, but I have to go back and actually check the numbers, and I'm happy to share them with Brian and Kevin, and they can share.
Okay. I know where to find Terry.
Yes, and the second part was the manufacturing that OBI provided, and that was another $200,000 for the manufacturing.
Wow, that's great.
So they have made a significant commitment.
Another question I've got is, with Rett syndrome, symptoms can vary greatly from day to day. How do you account for this in the assessments? Do the parents document daily symptoms?
Yes, so we have different types of assessments. So some of the assessments ask you about the last 2 weeks, and they ask you to estimate average for the last 2 weeks. Some of the assessments are direct observation with us. By definition, we miss if kids do some things at other settings, but not in front of us. And that's why you'll see some repetition. So sometimes parents complain that some of the instruments overlap. But for example, although we look at some of the motor stuff directly, we have a second questionnaire that's you reporting on what they can actually do at home, so that we can see whether we have missed it because we could not actually properly observe it. And then we have seizures. For the kids who have seizures, you keep seizure diaries. So you would have to keep the diaries for the duration of the study for us to be able to get a sense of whether there is any effect on seizures. It's an exploratory measure because it was not seen in the animal model, but we don't want to miss the opportunity to capture it. So it's a very good question, and it's not special to Rett's, it's for all neurodevelopmental conditions. Kids do things one day and they don't do them the next. All kids do that. The problem with what we call episodic measurements, so when we measure at the time of the clinic, is we miss what happens in between. In fact, there is a very large effort now to get a significant funding to start piloting wearables and digital measures to be collecting automatically day-to-day information from the kids. We're not ready for this, but we are working on getting it funded. But it's exactly to address this problem that when we look, we don't always get the full picture.
Great. Interesting question is, will the trial be open to participants from the US?
So there is a bit of a problem with this. Theoretically speaking, there is no reason not to, right? If we can fund you, we can fund somebody's travel from the US. We cannot guarantee them crossing the border, and we know these days it's closed. But if somebody wanted to show up theoretically, there is no reason why they couldn't. The only problem we have is that malpractice for the physicians involved in the trial and the malpractice insurance for the trial does not cover does not cover lawsuits in the US. So typically we don't, but if somebody was extremely motivated, what legal would make them do is sign all kinds of paperwork that if they were ever to submit a legal complaint, they would have to file in Canada so that it's covered under. So there is a lot of paperwork and a lot of hassle. So typically I tell families who call me from the US, just wait it out. Like we'll finish the study, we'll tell you what it shows. If it's really promising, I'm sure we're gonna have a more than one country trial, but theoretically it's doable. So if somebody was extremely motivated and had to put up with all this paperwork, it can be done.
Yeah, and I imagine it would be very impractical right now with the border restrictions, having to quarantine. Yes. Yeah. And what's quite interesting to me is we've had a lot of these trials operating in the US financed by these pharmaceutical companies, and they've always taken the position that they'd complete their trials in the US, see what the results are, and then they could use that data to submit to Health Canada for potential approval, which is great as long as they're able to find enough people to fill all the slots in their trial. Now with the COVID situation, it seems they're looking a little bit outside of the US. I know O.R.S.A has been contacted by a couple of these organizations, which we can't really talk about. It could potentially lead to something, potentially not. Yeah, it's just to see that they're, looking in Canada, looking in Europe and other places now that it's a lot more difficult to get participants into trials.
Yeah, and I think COVID in the States has put a lot more restrictions on hospitals and trials, and they're looking elsewhere now. So I currently have 2 non-disclosure agreements that I'm waiting to get completed so that I can start talking to people up here about potential trials.
It's also important for you guys to know that we're in the same position. So we also have a bunch of non-disclosure agreements, and we're talking to people. I'm happy if we get permission to talk to each other. We just have to get some permission so we can talk to each other. The main issue we've had, so we actually have created internally a priority list from what we think most promising down the list. The main problem we've had is that we were supposed to be done by the antioxidant study by now. And we cannot probably at Holland Bloorview run 2 trials at the same time. We don't have enough kids with Rett's to be able to meet requirements for both studies. So what we have communicated back to at least one of the candidates that we are excited about their compound is that depending on their timelines, if we finish antioxidant, we'd be happy to talk to them.
Great. Couple more questions sent to me by chat. One says, I understand we are all anxious to get started, but would it be worth waiting to be able to get more kids involved?
Yeah, so more kids is fine. So the duration of the study can be modified. It's money. So money is difficult, but money is also only money. So if you're halfway through the trial and we're seeing that we are very slow and we need to extend, because we have already extended by 2 years, as you can imagine, as we're waiting for manufacturing, we would need to figure out a way to fund personnel to extend. I'm not sure that if we wait any longer, so there are all kinds of problems. First of all, I do think there is a timing to these things. For example, Jim is already working on something that he thinks may even be better. Like, so as we're waiting, we get caught up on the next new thing, and we lose the opportunity to have tested all the things that may have surprised us in the meantime. So there is a timing to this that's important for that reason. The other reason is, in all honesty, the more we delay this, the least likely we are to take a large pharmaceutical company's trial, which we have committed to do if you guys are, if the families are interested. So if we're constantly in competition with the pharmaceutical trial, basically we make it less and less likely that we're going to be involved in the pharmaceutical trial. So to think about, I mean, we have thought about all of this. We also don't have, we struggle, I meant to say we struggle with all of this. We have talked about, is this the right thing? Should we delay? But delaying by 18 months is not trivial. It's a long time. So are we delaying until we have a vaccine, or are we delaying until kids start coming more easily to the hospital? And what are we going to do at the beginning of the second wave? So if kids have started, we're going to be in the same position we were this wave with the previous trial in autism, where we had a bunch of kids and all of a sudden everything was shut down and these poor kids had to come in and see us in full gear, autistic kids. So so there's yeah, I mean, all solutions have pluses and minuses. My preference is to try to push through to starting, just because this thing has been delayed so much, even if it means that we're going to have to go slow and recruit over a longer period of time.
Yeah, makes sense. One more question here is just what are the requirements for patients to participate? I guess they're asking about the inclusion criteria.
Inclusion criteria, so that's very important. So as it stands right now, the kids have to be between the age of 2 to 21, and they have to be able to stand. even if it's with support. They have to be able to stand because the main outcome, the main thing that James saw in the animal model was motor improvement. And if a kid is already on a wheelchair, we think the chances that we're going to make them get up is harder. We may be able to do it in the long run, but it's harder to see over 8 weeks. But if we have kids who can stand and all we need is a step, or if they have a step and we get a second and a third, or then that is a much more likely way to pick up if the combination is doing something. So that's how it stands right now. You should know also that we made a commitment to the donor that gave us the money for the biomarkers, that we're going to extend the age range to 30. Although there are not many people in their late 20s who are standing and walking, but there are some. And one of the people who are is a family friend of the donor. So we will extend one.
Is everyone else able to hear still? I've lost.
I lost audio.
Nope. Okay, I'm going to give you 1 minute, and maybe what I'll do is I'm just going to share the my screen for a second. Bring up the clinicaltrials.gov site.
Okay, I was just going to mention that to you as well, Brian. There is another company out there that is currently enrolling by invitation a clinical trial in Canada. The company is called GW Pharmaceuticals, and it's a cannabinoid study. It's listed on clinicaltrials.gov under Canadian Rett syndrome trials.
Yeah, so I'll just bring up, you guys can see my screen, correct?
Yes, and they're actually looking for one more French-speaking individual to participate in a study to be able to convert their documents from English to French. O.R.S.A was able to find 4 individuals, and they're looking for a 5th. And in particular, they'd like to find a adult male to participate in it to kind of balance things out, because we've had 4 females participate.
Yeah, so if anyone does know someone who could participate with the translation, then definitely reach out to Kevin. You could email info@rett.ca or contact us through social media, or just let us know in the chat right here. It'd definitely be helpful to getting that, that one off the ground. So this is the clinicaltrials.gov site. This has information on most of the trials that are currently running globally for Rett syndrome. So you can just type Rett here under condition or disease, select Rett syndrome, search for it, and you will get a list of 56 studies. And you'll see right here the Holland Bloorview antioxidant cocktail trial, which would list all of the things that we were just discussing with the inclusion criteria and the a detailed description on what the study entails, what are the outcome measures, all that sort of thing in here. You can go through and filter these to see, like, if you're only interested in studies that are currently recruiting, you can do that. You could filter by not yet recruiting. You could look at ones that are completed, and often they'll provide links to the outcomes from those studies. But I see we've got you back. Let's see if we can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, so I think you were just, you just finished your answer to the inclusion criteria. I think we got you cut off about halfway through that answer.
So should I repeat that?
Sure.
Okay, so again, 2 to 21 as it stands. The kids have to have Rett syndrome, but they don't have to have a specific mutation. So all kinds of different mutations are eligible. And they have to be able to stand, so we can see them making some motor progress, because that's what James saw in the animal model. We have made a commitment to extend this to age 30 once we get started, because our donor who gave us the money for the biomarker work has a family friend who's in their late 20s who's still standing. And so we will make that the minute we get started with Health Canada. We don't, I mean, there are some exclusion criteria. They're things that you can think about, right? So we don't want to be part of another trial. If you are part of our trial, so that we know what's changing and for what reason. We typically like your medications to be stable, but we like them to be stable when you come into the study. If you had to make a change during the study, we will deal with it statistically. We want kids to be relatively medically stable, right? If this is a time where you have a major autonomic crisis, probably that's not the time to be in a randomized controlled trial. Reasonable things, like we understand the nature of the condition. We know the kids are never totally stable and they keep changing and all of that. But we are looking for just basic safeguards for putting kids into a trial, and because it's not clinical care, right? It is still a trial, it's still an experiment.
Yeah, I think that's really important for everyone to think about too when you're putting your child into a trial like this. You're doing it to benefit the community, not to receive care for your child. So if you happen to not meet some of those inclusion or exclusion criteria, don't take it personally. You know, something else is going to come along, or when this research actually, you know, completes, and if it's successful and it comes to market, then everyone's going to benefit from that. And the trial could actually, you know, not be successful if we were just allow everyone in.
It's also important to remember that as invested as we are, we may find nothing. We may see that at the end of the day, all of this was not worth it, right? That in the mouse, with a small brain, the small body, and the small length of the neurons, you can see it, but once you start putting it in bigger bodies with slightly different biology, we can replicate what we saw in the mouse. So it's important to remember, it's an experiment. We're just testing whether we can translate from one species, which is the mouse, to the human. In this case, it doesn't always work.
Okay, one more question. Can you be out of province to participate?
Yeah, so the issue here is that we don't have funding for people to travel, and that's why Kevin stepped in. We have no reason not to accept people from anywhere. We have focused on recruitment through Ontario because this is an Ontario grant, but it does not exclude people from outside. Again, my general advice to people would be, you will have to come once a month for 18 weeks to do an experiment. So think through for your family whether this is actually worth it, or whether you want to wait until the study is finished, in which case we can tell you this is the cocktail that works. I mean, I'm a bit nervous to say what I'm going to say, because as Kevin knows, it has been a very difficult relationship with a manufacturing company. But what they have committed is that they would have it available the minute the study finishes, which doesn't usually happen, because the components are approved under the natural health product. So in theory, they can put it out not as a drug, but as a natural health product right away after the study is finished. So think about whether it's worth all this travel and all this involvement to be part of the experiment, whether you may want to wait.
Yeah. Okay, one more question. If we're already registered with POND, and are we registered for the study? How do we confirm this, or how do we register for the study?
Yes. So if you're part of POND, you're going to get an automatic invitation because you're part of our mailing list. If you're seeing as part of the Holland Bloorview clinic, you're going to get an automatic invitation. You're going to get invited during your clinical appointments. But if you're outside of those two things, that's why we are linked up with O.R.S.A. So the study will be announced, and you will get contact information about who to call and when to call, and you can call in and we can bring you in.
And once we get all that information, we'll be sharing it through our membership, which is a free membership that you can sign up online for. And we'll also obviously be putting it out through all of our social media channels.
All right, so we're coming up just on 9 p.m. We've got a couple more minutes left. Is there any last questions?
Brian, it's Scott here.
Hey.
Sabrina had a question earlier about masks versus face shields. So I think it was asking if the person cannot wear a face mask, would a shield be acceptable?
So according to federal guidelines, no. So the shield is on top of the mask. So we wear shields on top of our masks, either goggles or shields. The kids are not asked to wear the shields, although they can wear them if they want to, but they're not considered the equivalent of a mask because they cannot prevent droplets from when somebody articulates of leaving the immediate environment. Now, you can argue all kinds of things about kids with Rett syndrome, right? Like how much of vocalization happens back and forth that spreads droplets. But unfortunately, the guidelines are not diagnosis specific. The guidelines are hospital they're actually provincial guidelines, and they are consistent with federal guidelines about minimizing droplet disbursement. So masks are required unless we have plexiglass. At this point, like, you know, things changing every.
Yes, but you did say it would be possible, for example, everybody to be in full PPE then, if a mask
Yes, we can absolutely have a kid without a mask if the rest of the team is in full PPE, which we have been doing. So we can do it. I'm just telling you, it looks very weird to the kids. So you would have as a family to judge whether your child would be okay with everybody in full PPE. There's all kinds of strategies that we are piloting out. I personally find them all creepy, to be honest. You know, maybe the families don't. So we, you know, wearing buttons with our faces on it so the kid can see what we look like. We have started getting masks where the mouth, there's a plastic in the middle and you can see the mouth. Again, to me, it looks like you took a marker around your mouth and made like a circle. So it looks quite unnatural. So unless somebody was really lip reading and wanted to look at your lips, I don't know that the kids are going to like them. But we're going to try all of those things and see how the kids and the families respond.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Okay, one more question in the chat here. What are the criteria for being medically stable for the study?
Yeah, so for medical stability, we're looking for two things. We're looking general medical stability. So if you are at risk of being hospitalized, if you know you have a serious condition right now, a serious medical condition, please disclose that. But the more common one that we do is stability on medications. And so typically medications have to be stable for about a period of a month. There are some exceptions to the rule based on how long some medicines stay in our system. But most medications, if you're stable for a month, you're considered stable.
Great, thanks. All right, any final questions before we sign off? Okay, well, thank you so much to our panelists for being here tonight. It's really exciting news, both on the basic research front and on this potential first clinical trial in Canada. So thank you so much. And hopefully we'll be able to share some news about this thing getting off the ground with our community soon.
Yes.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you, guys.